Welcome back to Underground Strategy. I'm Tony, joined as always by Max, and today we're excited to welcome back a returning guest, military scholar and practitioner, Amos Fox. And Amos has spent years studying modern warfare, especially the evolving nature of tactics, operational art, and strategy. Last time, I think it's safe to say we barely scratched the surface, although we were at it for a couple of hours. And today we're going to dive into some of our listener questions, and they've come in from militaries and from scholars around the world. And without further ado, let's get into it. Amos, welcome back to the show.
Hey, gentlemen, thanks so much for having me back. It was a pleasure last time. Again, pleasure this time. Unfortunately, we don't have hours today, but I wish we did. And again, I'm always happy to come back and talk more. So if we don't get to everything, by all means, if you and your guests don't get tired of me, I'm always happy to come back.
We're delighted, man. I'm going to get straight into it now, and I'm not going to mention names or which militaries our listeners are affiliated to, but I'll just read the questions out. And the first one comes in, and it says, I have served in Afghanistan and worked with COIN, counterinsurgency frameworks, for years. Now it feels like Western forces are shelving all of that almost overnight, mainly as a reaction to Ukraine and the return of large-scale conventional war. So for our listeners, I think everyone knows, but referencing the full-scale invasion. But in many regions like Africa, the Middle East, COIN might still be the dominant form of conflict for the foreseeable future. Are we overcorrecting? Just because pure war is back on the table, does that really mean COIN is done, Amos?
Yeah, I don't think that any of these are ever done. I think they're always, you never know what's around the corner, right? You never know the intentions of strategic adversaries that are out there. And so to say one is done and the other's back, or one is back and the other's done, or any combination of, approaches or thinkings or strategies about warfare, I think is an incorrect way to view it. Now, the problem that I think a lot of folks have with this topic is that governments are bound by, resources, funding, right? For in the U.S., Congress appropriates the budget, and that's what funds the military. And there's a big long cycle that goes with all this. In the U.S., it's called the PALM cycle. And you have to program things like 5 years in advance to get anything done, unless there's, situations that monies can get turned on immediately and turned off immediately and reallocated immediately, right? And those are few and far between. Nonetheless, that's the big issue, I think. And so it's not that having lived through we have to figure out how to do COIN again when I was a young lieutenant in Iraq back in 2005 and 2006, and I had to work through that with the U.S. Army and relearn how to do COIN. I don't think that this or that isn't an institutional bias necessarily towards one. It's where do they need to devote their money? And because the cycles for money are what they are, to move such large amounts of money for big pieces of material, it takes time. And so this is a whole part of, why think tanks and things like that exist, is to try and get a glimpse into the future, knowing that they're never going to be right. The other part of that, too, is why would your adversary fight you in a way that, suits you? And so this is always going to exist. We being the U.S., for instance, were to go step off with whomever in the next great conflict, they're not going to fight us in a way that we're best suited, most likely, right? They're going to fight us asymmetrically. Asymmetrically doesn't mean irregular warfare necessarily. It just means fights us in a way that we're not best suited for, or in a place that we're not well suited for. I don't think we're forgetting anything. I don't think we're shelving or canning anything. I just think it's the people that look at the future are saying, we think this might be what's next. And as a result of that, we need to reorient the military. Ideally, you could do both, right? Or you could do everything, but you can't. And so you have to prioritize. At the end of the day, it comes down to prioritization of what governments have to prioritize for the militaries. And so, even if you walk around and talk to a lot of people in uniform in the various militaries in which they serve, you'll hear them say that. Very few people will be like, oh man, we've got to totally get rid of all this counterinsurgency stuff and fully embrace large-scale combat operations and bring back huge tank divisions. It's very much, we need to do both, but we can't fund both. So what are we going to fund? So long answer. I probably could have wrapped that up in like a sentence, but, sometimes I ramble.
Not at all. It was a good one, and definitely not too long. We like thorough and long answers here. But more importantly, Amos, it is good to have you back with us again. And yes, there is definitely a Western framing baked into how we talk about this. A while ago, I wrote a short piece on what I call the COIN hangover, and I got immediate pushback from a South African officer, and he was basically saying, hangover? We are still drinking this stuff. So a lot of this, of course, depends on where you're standing. Which brings us to the next one. That goes like this. A lot of our doctrine still assumes a clean line between war and peace, but that's not how it works in practice. Is it time to rethink how we define conflict phases, or is that just semantics?
So I'm looking at the questions that you guys provided also. So this is the clean line between war and peace. This is one of my favorite questions because I just finished teaching a class on military innovation and peace and war. So like this was at the heart of the course, right? And the first thing that I make my students read is J.F.C. Fuller, not the full book, but page 65, if you're interested. J.F.C. Fuller's The Foundations of the Science of War. He says that there's never been a line between war and peace or peace and war. It's always been this, I forget the exact phrase he used, and I don't want to say blur because that's what everybody says today, but it wasn't blur. But it was this indiscriminate phase transition. There was no clear line. You were basically always enmeshed in both because you're either participating in war actively or you're preparing for war because inevitably, unfortunately, you're probably always going to find yourself in another war. It may not be, large-scale combat operations, maybe some sort of brush fire, small war thing, but inevitably, especially states that have the means to go out and pursue their own self-interest, or states or non-state actors that don't have the means to adequately defend their self-interest, especially against big neighbors, they're going to find themselves stuck in this, this perpetual cycle. And so there is no line. There's never been a line. And that's what J.F.C. Fuller states. And I tend to agree with that. You're either preparing for war or you're fighting war, but there's no clear distinction. And if you think of it through that lens, then these ideas like hybrid warfare, gray zone, competition below the threshold of armed conflict, they shouldn't be like, gee, wow, this is great. Look at this new idea, right? I would offer instead, you should just go read some old theorists like J.F.C. Fuller, and I know he's crazy and, like to dabble in the occult. I think we may have talked about this before. Still love his writing, nonetheless, but there's a lot of value in all of these older people, older ideas, older theorists, early 20th century theorists in particular, because they really bring a lot of these ideas to foreign language that's easy to understand that we speak about. You can go back and read Sun Tzu and whomever, right? But some of the phrasing isn't written in a way that resonates with us. They're not talking about polities that exist anymore necessarily that resonate with us. And so it's almost a bit intangible. Then you also get people like, well, it depends on the translation that you're reading, right? I got it, dude. Not everybody speaks, all these languages, especially if you're an American like me who only speaks one language, like we need to break that mental model because I don't believe it exists. I think like J.F.C. Fuller said, it's this open-ended thing that you're either always fighting a war or preparing for war, but there's no clear distinction. There's no clear line. And if you're preparing for war appropriately, you should be looking at war through all the lenses of possibility that exists between doing nothing and doing everything, right? And if you do that, then you can better think about how to frame the different rungs on the ladder from doing absolutely nothing, truly being at peace, to, participating in large-scale combat operations. But that's a big thing. Like, that's one of the things, like, at the end of the day, when I graded all my essays at the end of the semester last week, right? If you didn't say J.F.C. Fuller is right, you didn't score well on the exam. I'm kidding, but that was one of my big takeaways I wanted for the students.
And we do welcome feedback from your students, Amos. We are a democratic podcast.
That's good. That's good.
No, that was a great answer. I really like that. And it's a fair point. We have to acknowledge those that came before us. Just because someone thinks that they have this brilliant idea, it might just be that there's a whole body of work out there, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think when you look around at a lot of stuff that's published today, and when you look at a lot of what militaries write today too. So again, I worked at Army Futures Command before I retired. And so I worked on the Army Warfighting Concept for 2040. And if you said J.F.C. Fuller, like, you would have gotten blank stares from a lot of people, right? If you'd have said Little Heart, they'd have been like, oh, indirect approach. Oh, like, hey, bro, you're missing like a good chunk of this guy's ideas by focusing on that one little thing. And you mentioned a lot of these other people. Like, everybody wants to talk about Clausewitz, but if you think about, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't speak German, but Kolmar Vandergaltz, he was also a very big imperialist, right? So there's a lot of negativity that goes with that, but there's very insightful thoughts about military theory, military thought when you go back and look at those people. They may have been deplorable human beings, but if you want to understand a broad range of thinking about how to approach this weird space between true peace and true war, right? There's all sorts of people out there that have already written on it. And so, again, we should not read something because it's old and it's not this new publication that's come out from this new think tank with the new hot person on the street, right? Like there is tons of value in going back and looking at old theory and old theorists, because a lot of it I personally have found is very sound.
If you're dialed in, drop us a review on your app. Watching on YouTube, hit subscribe to join the conversation. All right, back to it.
And on that topic, and I think we touched on this in our previous discussion, it's how the modern or the 20th century has taken a number of concepts and put the whole discussion around war in it. And I think you had a lot to say about it. And this is attrition. And I'll read the question now. It says, there's a lot of talk about attrition warfare lately. But honestly, I'm not sure anyone really agrees on what that even means. Is it just when things get static and bloody? Or is there actually a theory behind it? And by it, they mean attrition.
Yeah, I love this. So I don't remember if I said this last time we talked. I got a book coming out with Bloomsbury. It's called Maneuver is Dead, Understanding Land Warfare in the 21st Century. I've got a whole chapter dedicated to that subject because the short answer is no, there's really not a theory of attrition, like explaining here is the idea, here's how it fits within the larger phenomena of war, here's how it fits with maneuver, here's the theory of maneuver, here's how it fits with positional warfare, here's the theory of positional warfare, here's how it fits within the larger idea of warfare, here's how it fits within combined arms. By and large, that doesn't exist. It's just a derogatory term people throw around to, denigrate casualty-producing methods of fighting as opposed to movement-centric, seemingly better ways of fighting, right? So I go through, and I've got an article based on that chapter from that book with RUSI Journal right now that I'm hoping gets picked up for publication. I'm still waiting to hear back. It's under review right now, so fingers crossed. And I love RUSI Journal because of the people that we talked about just a moment ago, JFC Fuller, Liddell Hart, all these folks that have come, 100 years ago that were publishing in RUSI and speaking at RUSI and getting ideas out there through RUSI. And so I always try and go back to RUSI for that reason, personally, for me to make that, it's almost this like dorky connection I want to make with those guys that no longer exist. So I think that there is a theory of attrition, and it's essentially, so I'm of two minds when it comes to this whole idea. So I think attrition isn't a type of warfare. I think it's a characterization. All right. So this is one of those cognitive dissonance. So I just said one thing that I think. Now, here's the dissonance part. I also think it is, or it can be a form of warfare. I've gone to the can be a form of warfare camp lately just because I've found it too hard to convince people that it's not and that it's a characterization, because it has become so ingrained, or it is so ingrained in everybody's mind that it's a type of warfare. And I'm like, okay, I'll play your game. I'll make it a type of warfare. I'll provide a theory and we'll talk about it. But the bottom line is, in my assessment, and in my book, I introduced this idea I call battlefield parallax, which is essentially where you're at on the battlefield dictates how you have to fight to a large degree. And then when you factor in all the elements of the variables on the battlefield, that further influences that, right? And so when you think about, especially from the U.S. standpoint, we're almost entirely an expeditionary military, right? So anytime our army goes anywhere, it's going somewhere. We're not defending anything at home. So we're always moving from place to place. And because of that, we always have space to do maneuver to a point. And then once you've hit a point, and I don't know, and I don't lay it out in that book, I don't really define what that point is because it's always subject to the relative situation. But once you've hit that point, you go through this transition, right? There's a phase transition where you go from being able to do maneuver to being able to do maneuver and positional warfare to only being able to do attritional and positional warfare because you're too close. Once your forces have converged, like on the contact line in Ukraine, people are like, oh, we've got to restore maneuver. How are we going to restore maneuver when there's no space to move? You have to have space to move to do maneuver. And so that's one of the key elements of this theory of attrition is, if there's no space to move, you're probably going to have to focus on firepower over movement until you can create a breakthrough or create a flank, right? Because you can intentionally create a flank if no flanks exist to try and open up a movement corridor to then start doing maneuver again, right? But again, if you look at Russia-Ukraine, what you had was, Russian and Ukrainian forces merged to the point that, the Russians were like, either A, we're good, we're not going to keep moving forward because we basically have what we want, or B, they just weren't able to continue moving forward because the Ukrainians stopped them. or C, a combination of those two things. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, was the same thing, right? They moved forward until they couldn't move forward. And this is part of the problem too. It requires manpower to do these things, because if you don't have sufficient land forces to conduct offensive operations, you're going to run out of the ability to do anything other than positionally defend, attritionally defend, right? So the Ukrainians can't do maneuver because they don't have sufficient force to do maneuver. It actually takes more forces to unleash yourself and make bold movements than it does a smaller force. And so I think that's also a bit of a myth and an error in the way that we understand how maneuver and position and attritional warfare all fit together.
And the further you get from the field, the cleaner these definitions seem to become, right? In theory, it's either maneuver or it's not. But anyone who has been close to a real front line knows the shift is gradual. It's messy and it's often forced by circumstance and not by preference. And sometimes when I talk to junior officers, especially the ones who are early on in their careers, there's often this need to box things up. You know, maneuver here, attrition there, clear lines and categories. And of course, that helps when you are first learning the trade. But reality has never cared much about categories, right? It's always a mix. And the longer you're in it, the more you realize how fluid these transitions are. Like the battlefield parallax you're describing. But I'm going to try to stay on track because the next question actually ties straight into this one. And it reads like this. There's this idea that Western forces have forgotten how to fight long and grinding wars. More drones, better ISR, etc. But isn't the real problem how we are built and not what we are buying?
Yeah, I don't think we've forgotten how to fight those. I think we're trying to place our preference ahead of reality. Our preference is we don't want to do that, right? This is a huge reason you see all these proxies being used all over the world today, because nobody wants to go fight the war themselves, you know? So it's a lot easier, cheaper, better, theoretically, to have somebody else go do all the fighting for you. We don't want to do it, right? Same thing with all this technology that we're investing in. Long-range precision strike, drones, all these cool technologies that should theoretically take the place of human beings on the battlefield, right? And all we got to do, and you hear there's all sorts of people talking about this, and they've been talking about it. All we got to do is give Ukraine more HIMARS and more ATACMS, and that'll solve the problem. But the problem isn't they don't have enough stuff to blow people up on the ground, which is the solution we are trying to introduce, right? If we can see more, see everywhere, see all the time, we can strike more, strike everywhere, strike all the time. But that overlooks and again, this is a term that has baggage, but I'm going to use it anyway, the systems way of thinking about things. Everything on the battlefield is a system, right? And systems seek order, they seek survival, they seek self-organization, right? And so when they're attacked, they're going to do things that allow those aspects of systemic thinking to exist, right? And so when somebody's attacked from above with a drone, from above with long-range strike, odds are that's not going to kill everybody. And the people that aren't killed are going to go hide, wait out the attack, because everything's going to stop at some point, right? Then they're going to come back out and either continue doing what they're doing, go on the offensive, whatever. And at the same time, they're going to be trying to learn about what's attacking them. And so they're going to be sensing in their own right on whatever it was that was attacking them and trying to learn from that. And so we are trying to, I'll just say the U.S. in this case, we're trying to set aside the uncomfortableness of, like, you still have to have people on the ground to go clear out bad guys. If what's being fought for is territory, you have to have people on the ground to go clear out the other people that are occupying the territory that needs to be liberated. Because at the end of the day, when people get hit from things in the sky, they're going to hide until it's safe to come back, right? Then they're going to come back. And so that cycle is going to continue. Those people are always going to be there. And so this whole more HIMARS, more precision strike, more drones, more this, more that. What you need are more people in these cases, more infantrymen, more, armored formations, whatever the case may be, to go in and physically remove the people that are occupying that territory. In the case of wars where territory isn't the objective, first, I don't know many wars where that's actually true. Like, if you look around, all the wars that have been going on are basically being fought for some sort of piece of land. So you have to remove the people that are occupying that piece of land, whichever way, you're voting in that case. But you got to do that, right? And so we're not even overlooking, we're denying that, if we're being honest. We're denying that those requirements of land warfare that have to be done. You have to take territory, you have to hold territory, prevent counterattacks, right? You can't be counterattacked and then be like, oh man, we just lost the territory. All those things you have to be able to do. And that's the problem with long-range precision strike. It can't hold territory, can't take territory. Drones can't take territory, right? You can't land a quadcopter or an FPV drone and say, all right, this 500-meter area here is now secure and under our control, right? So these kinds of things are the ideas, though, that are driving a lot of what we're doing. Like last week, I think it was, or late April of 2025, Secretary of Defense released a memo and it said, hey, we're going to cut some more stuff from the U.S. Army, and in its place, we're going to put a bunch more drones, and we're going to get rid of manned this and manned that. We're going to have all these AI systems and precision strike systems. And he called it replacing outdated technology and formations and replacing it with war-winning capabilities. Problem there is, A, he didn't define what war-winning means. B, how does that drive a war-winning strategy? C, we've heard this all before, time and time again. If you go back, Ben Conable just published a book called Ground Combat, and in there he records essentially the exact same ideas that McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, leading up to the Vietnam War and through the Vietnam War, and Westmoreland, who was the chief, or he was later the chief of staff, he was running the war in, I almost said Afghanistan, the war in Vietnam. That was like a Freudian slip. The war in Vietnam, for a good portion of it. And if you read what they wrote, and Conable has it in there, right? If you read what they wrote and what they testified to Congress, it's almost identical to the stuff you hear people say today. And none of it came even remotely close to being true, right? And so, we can be like, well, today it's different. These technologies are going to do it for us today. But they probably said the same thing about the same people before them, So it's, again, this idea that, and that's what you saw with the Vietnam War, right? We wanted low boots on the ground, lots of precision strike, and precision strike's always relative to the time in which it exists. Back then, they thought their precision strike was hyper precise, And so we tried to limit the number of people we had there, and then we realized, oh crap, that's not actually working. We need to bump up the numbers of people that we have there. And then we realized, they've got, sanctuary in a third-party countries, that we can't really get after, we can't really attack or get to. And so you have to quit denying reality of war, right? And the reality of war, there are certain requirements that have to be done in order to, on the battlefield, win, right? Now, beyond the battlefield, the policy, the politics, that's a whole nother conversation. But I think we're denying, we haven't forgotten. If you talk to a lot of people can tell you all sorts of stuff about it, but it's policymakers and senior military leaders trying to deny the reality of land wars today and warfare in general. And that's what's, I think, driving that.
And while we're on that topic, something that links to this and very much in that kind of operational space, and I quote now, should we still be focusing so much on tempo and aggression? And I think you've answered a part of this in your previous discussion, Amos, but I'm continuing. Most of what I see from Ukraine is just endurance, holding, absorbing. Not much room for maneuver in that. Should we be teaching patience and positional dominance instead?
Short answer is yes. Again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think through the steps, right? If you just wire diagram out, like, what are the possibilities of this? And say, okay, we got two forces. One wants to eliminate the other as a state and a nation and a people. We have another one that doesn't want that to happen and wants to continue to exist. How is this likely to unfold? And then, unlike most of the commentary you've seen throughout the war, especially at the beginning, where they're always like, Russia's on the verge of bankruptcy. Russia's economy can only stand for so much longer. Russia only has so many more people. If you go back and think about and look at theories of power, right? So if you go back and look at Robert Dahl, John French, several other people, again, these are people that wrote stuff in the 50s. So I know it's, antiquated and old, but it's really good because they talk about things like bases of power, and there's latent bases of power that can get activated, right? And turned on. Some of those latent bases of power are pulling in people, right? And this is a new concept, having coalitions, bringing in partners to help offset shortcomings in one's own resources, right? And so we can't think that Russia is just going to go, hey to the little right up the middle, slam itself into the wall of Ukrainian stout defense, and then throw up its hands and be like, oh my God, we're done, right? Like, first off, Putin is pragmatic. He wouldn't still be in power if he were not pragmatic. So you have to then assume that the Russian military, as a byproduct of Putin's, worldview, is also pragmatic, and everything that Russia does reflects that pragmatism. And so they're going to be looking for ways to survive, right? And so that's going to create an influx in bases of power, going to offset the inherent, looking at the initial, and this is one of those whole things when we look at linearity versus non-linearity, right? You can't look at the initial starting conditions of a system and be like, that's the system, right? Because it has feedback loops and it's trying to learn from what's going on in the environment and trying to continue to survive. And so that, to me, is one of the first things we have to always consider when we think about this, right? And then secondly, what happens, again, this is another element within that tree. Okay, so we've gotten through this phase where Ukraine didn't get defeated in the first 48 or 72 hours, and it's continued to resist, it's continued to fight. However, there is a huge, disparity in resources, at least from the initial starting conditions standpoint. How's that likely going to play out? Well, they're probably going to run out of steam before they accomplish all their objectives. What are they going to do when they do that? They're probably going to, end up taking up a position and defending from that position, and then trying to, what's the word they used? Endure, right? They're going to try to endure through that until they can get to a point where they get, either more capability to go on the offensive, take back whatever they can take back, or negotiate from the best possible position they can negotiate from politically. But we, again, want to overlook that, and we want to just think, no. This one way of thinking about warfare, these two ways of thinking about warfare are better than this broad interpretation of how wars may actually unfold. And as a result of that, we overlook those things. So, yes, the other part of that is we've seen the drain on munitions before. If you go back to, I was in Iraq, I worked in the J5, the plan section for the land component commander in the last couple of months of the Battle of Mosul. There's all open source information. Like, we ran out of precision guided munitions. We ran out of basically everything that wasn't ballistic artillery. Because if you look at what was going on in Mosul, very PGM heavy fight, but then also next door in Syria, also huge PGM laden fight going on there, plus what was going on in Afghanistan, plus the Battle of Marali in the Philippines was still going on, heavy use of PGMs there. And then we throw up our arms and we're like, oh my God, we're out of PGMs, right? So this is the other thing too, when we think about endurance and how to fight these long wars where you're going to be fighting positionally, right? And General Rainey, the Army Futures Command, a while back, maybe a year ago, said something to the effect of, towed artillery is dead. No, dude, it's not dead. It's actually really, really useful. How we use it probably needs to be modified. But to say that thing is no longer useful is creating a huge vulnerability in yourself if you're looking to completely replace it. So I think like that, we got to look at either finding ways to make those munitions cheaper. This is part of that class that's talking about innovation in peace and war. One of the things I talk about in there is the cost of a PGM versus the cost of a ballistic artillery shell, right? You're talking tens of thousands of dollars versus like $800. And the production cycle of those is different as well. So you can quickly produce, essentially a concrete thing full of explosive versus this, super fancy thing. And the other thing with that too is ballistic artillery today is actually pretty precise. We call it an area fire weapon. But if you get the 5 elements required for accurate predictive fire, basic artillery is actually pretty good. So I think when we think about how we think about endurance in the future on the battlefield and positional fighting, because again, if you start getting attacked, what are you going to do? You're going to go hide, right? Look, I just got this in the mail today too. Second edition, Tony King, Urban Warfare in the 21st Century, just came out. Got a signed copy, in fact, as well. He signed it for me. But one of the key things to remember is like the world is becoming more urbanized, not less. And road networks are becoming bigger. Like I live outside Austin, Texas, and the road networks to get out to the town that I live into from Austin to here, it's one huge, like just connected thing. There's no open area any longer. And so this area is not unique in that regard. That phenomena is happening everywhere. And especially like in the developing world, right? And so there's very few places where you're going to have this space to go do maneuver, right? You're going to be choked in. People are going to be trying to hide to survive, right? And so we have to think about that. The more people try and hide, the more people tuck into urban areas, right? The more difficult it's going to be, the longer these conflicts are going to last, the harder it's going to be to go in and just kind of quickly win. And so we have to really be thinking about endurance and how a we can endure, because we may find ourselves, whoever the we is in this case, pick yourself if that works for you. But we may have to be on the other end of that, and we may be the ones enduring as well, right? We may be the people sitting in the steel factory in Mariupol trying to just, continue to survive. So, yeah, I think that's 100% something we got to be thinking about, continuing to move forward.
Absolutely. And if there are any Finns listening, they are probably grinning at this point because they never ditched their artillery. They stored it, they trained on it, and they treated it like it mattered. But meanwhile, Sweden did what Sweden always does. We cut, we modernize, and we hope for the best. I mean, we got the archers, but we dumped the mindset that makes them count. And that thinking that tech is going to protect you is a great way to lose slowly. All right, next one cuts right into the same problem. And it goes like this. There's been a lot of debate amongst us lately about whether we're just too focused on tactics. Strategy always sounds kind of abstract. Honestly, it feels like the lack of it is exactly what's breaking down our operational thinking. Do you see the same thing?
Yes, completely agree. I think that we have a lot of things like technology, right? We put means ahead of ends, right? And we think about means-driven strategy, probably not necessarily on purpose, but that also reflects a poor understanding of strategy, right? If we think technology, a means, right, is going to drive us to victory, well, what's the criteria of victory? How have we defined what victory is in a given context, right? If that technology does not align with that end, right, then the ways that are associated with that are complete bunk, right? So again, it goes back to this whole thing we were talking about with Russia, Ukraine. And I heard a podcast the other day. Mick Ryan was talking, and he's like, "Oh, it's not about territory." Oh, okay, that's fine. Mick Ryan's great. I love Mick Ryan, but it is a lot about territory when you talk about Russia, Ukraine, right? Like Ukraine wants to get its territory back. It can't get it back without people on the ground to go in and clear out those bad guys, like we talked about. But the strategy that a lot of people are talking about and banning about, or have kicked around, doesn't align with that. Again, it's like the whole PGM, attackums, all that stuff. Like, that's not going to solve the problem. You're putting the means ahead of the ends and not the ends ahead of the means, and then figuring out how to align all those. And it's ironic too, because a lot of the people that talk about this stuff should know better, but they continue to make these same errors in strategic thinking. So I completely agree. I just don't understand. I think a lot of it is people get fascinated by things that look cool, and sound cool. And it's like, hey, look at this new toy. And you're like, oh man, this toy's great. I'm going to use it for everything. Right? Doesn't really do anything. And it's the same thing too. I have a conversation with a buddy of mine all the time about this. A lot of times, specifically as it relates to maneuver, military folks have been so indoctrinated, right? It's part of their self-identity to think maneuver, and to think anything else is to question your own self-identity, your own self, the way you've been educated and groomed and brought along in life. And so you internally almost feel like a heretic because you're having this conversation with yourself. And a lot of people don't want to have that conversation because it causes them to question their own self-identity, as it at least relates to military, problems. And so they're like, nah, I'm not going to think about it, right? And then the answer is always, the strategy is always some sort of maneuver strategy or some sort of PGM strategy or some sort of, our partners will solve the problem strategy. When, like, if you look at Afghanistan, that strategy would have never worked because of the safe harbor that the Taliban had in Pakistan. Like, as long as that exists, you will never defeat the Taliban. You may defeat them in Afghanistan temporarily, but as an organization, strategically, they're doing great, and they're just going to wait until you leave and come back. And that's exactly what they did. Again, didn't take Clausewitz to think through that. A lot of people were pointing that out at the time, but we continued to double down on that because it was politically untenable to go, kick in the door in Pakistan and say, hey, we're here to party. We're looking for the Taliban, And so then that begs the question, well, then why even stay in Afghanistan at all? And so these are just some of the things that I think, like, we need to, as we continue to refine our thinking about strategy, and as we continue to have these conversations, point those things out. Like, that was an untenable strategy. It was completely not going to work. The U.S., NATO, if you want to roll them into it too, but the U.S. led mission in Afghanistan, once the Taliban went into Afghanistan, was completely out the window. So I just think there's a couple of factors there that really do undercut strategic thinking today. And we all want to sit back and stroke our beards and talk about Clausewitz, right? But that's cool. I do too. But we got to talk about real stuff, right? And real stuff is, again, starting with the ends. What's the goal? Let's define the goal. That's the other thing, too. If you go back and look at a lot of the Iraq-Afghanistan conversations, was the goal was slippery. The goalposts always move. We changed the metrics. We changed the goals because we realized they were unattainable, right? And so once you're in that position, your strategies bust, too. That was a good question. This is another one. I teach strategy at University of Houston, and this conversation we have all the time too. And this is one that I get fired up about. So next question. Otherwise, I'll burn the rest of our time on that.
If you ever thought, these guys, they deserve a drink, you're not wrong. Buy us a beer at undergroundstrategy.com/support. Fuel the banter, fund the strategy. Cheers. Back to the action.
The way you explained it there, Amos, it's just difficult, right? Like strategy and that ends that you mentioned, it's not easy. And the tactics and the stuff you mentioned, whatever kind of shiny new thing it is, that part is reasonably easy and resonates with armies, right? Like, or militaries, like, yeah, we're going to bomb that, we're going to move in there. That's the part that people are trained for, the kind of tactics, techniques, procedures.
That's what everybody signs up to do anyway, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And I find it even like, I think it wasn't General Michael Rose, it was Rupert Smith who said, in his Utility of War, and he says that when he was in Bosnia, a lot of it for him was engaging with that political thing. And in the absence, he said, he was still with us, but retired, a brilliant commander in many ways. And he had to create that political objective or something that kind of squared away with his policy to make sure that his strategic aims made sense, and he speaks about it in his book. He says, well, I needed that to really ground all of my operations that I'd planned. Now, of course, he was pretty savvy, but a long way of me agreeing with you and saying, I just think it's difficult questions and we need kind of commanders, policy people, civilians in the MOD or NATO, wherever, all of them, but to engage with this question, right?
Yeah, the other part of that, too, that I think is important, because I remember, if memory serves me correctly, Rupert Smith also was like prevented a war with Russia, basically, because we were like, screw it, we're going to go, I forget what it was, something with the airport there. And he intervened and was like, no, we're not doing whatever the thing was. I forget exactly the situation. But that to me is an important thing to think about, too, because if there is no clearly defined aims, a lot of military leaders, you read a bunch of these books that I got sitting around, they throw up their arms and then like the strategic aims were ambiguous and not clearly defined. To which I say, bro, go define them yourself and talk to your boss and say, this is what we're doing, sir, yes or no. And if you get a no, or you get yelled at, or you don't like it, you can resign and protest. You know what I mean? Like, you're still going to retire a 4-star general. You'll be fine, That paycheck is still going to be okay when you're sitting at the house and you're now Mr. or Mrs. whatever. And that's part of the problem, I think, is there's a lack of guts, essentially, on the part of a lot of these senior military leaders to go say, hey, you didn't give me good guidance. Here's what I'm taking away. This is what I'm driving towards. Does that work for you? Yes or no? And if no, tell me, we can modify this. And then I think it's also, this is a tool that's not used enough today, but like senior military leaders should resign, and say, hey, I'm out. Like, you're not doing your job as the policymaker here to help us set strategy. So just real quick, I had messed up when I said General Smith when we were talking about Kosovo War. It's General Mike Jackson.
Another question that came in was, it says, I quote, you talk about conflict realism, and I've been thinking about how that applies here in Sweden. We are obviously rearming fast. Still, a lot of our political and social mindset still feels very peacetime. Does that kind of mismatch matter in the long run?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you have to appreciate the fact, especially now, like in Sweden's case, you're part of a coalition that gets pulled into, or not a coalition, an alliance that gets pulled into a lot of things that, partner nations or allied nations probably wouldn't otherwise care about. So you have to start embracing the fact that you're going to be involved in more things than what you probably would have been, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, whatever the case may be, certainly a decade ago. And as part of that, again, it's going back to talking about and thinking about what's probable, not plausible, right? And so you can have sharks with laser beams doing all these cool things, but that's probably not going to happen. What's probably going to happen is you're going to find yourself in a grinding war of attrition. And so you have to orient yourself in that direction. And as you start looking and thinking about rearmament and force structure, you don't have to build a 1 million-man army. but you have to be thinking about how to build a million-man army and how to equip a million-man army and how to have the industrial depth to keep that thing going. And again, obviously, that million-man army is going to be different. It's a metaphor in many ways for a lot of countries that don't actually have the people to field a million-man army. But for bigger countries like the United States, like those are things we need to be thinking about. I did a meeting, whatever it is, not a conference, but a little like presentation about a month ago. And one of the things that one of the guys, he was a colonel, Army colonel, he's like, oh, the U.S. just doesn't have the stomach for doing this anymore. So it's politically untenable, and we'll never do that again. And I'm like, no, dude, you're putting preference and plausibility ahead of probability. Like, if we have to do it, we will do it. People will go kicking and screaming, but we'll have to do it. If we have to do a World War II type thing again, which I'm not saying we will, but like that will happen, I think it's unrealistic to suggest otherwise.
Well, that's exactly the kind of talk that disappears the moment things turn surreal. Everyone's got structure on paper until it has to hold under pressure. And we have spent years planning on how to project force, but not how to survive it. Because everyone wants scalable, lean, high-tech forces, but no one's honest about what happens when they start losing bodies and ammunition by the day. For the next one, you already covered most of this, but the last part of this question stuck with me. Here it comes. There's a lot of talk about how drones and artillery are changing the battlefield. But isn't the real question how your force is structured to absorb punishment and keep going?
Yeah, I think the big thing is force structure has to be expanded, not made smaller, lighter, and leaner. This is a big thing that's always coming out of the U.S. Army and Army Futures Command, for instance. Again, like I said, I work there. So I'm intimately familiar with all the, I'll call it nonsense, all the nonsense that's coming out about this. We have to be light, small, and dispersed, right? So that we prevent being identified on this transparent battlefield and targeted with drones and precision strike. Well, the transparent battlefield is transparent E, not, big T, big B. I'd say little t, little b in terms of transparent battlefield. And so there's that. There's also the fact that a lot of this stuff is still limited, right? Like when you think about who gets what in a war or in a battle or an engagement, we always, as commanders and staff folks, you identify a main effort, you identify the supporting efforts. The main effort gets plussed up, it gets all the cool stuff, it gets all the extra resources, and then a lot of the supporting efforts or shaping efforts or whatever term you want to call it, not the person that's doing the big thing, they get stripped of everything, right? And so they lose their artillery, they lose their drones, they lose their aviation, they lose everything, and they're fighting an economy of force on the flanks in this very generic situation, right? And so they have to be able to withstand whatever's coming their way. And that in itself presents an opportunity for the opponent, right, to then try and break through that weaker spot in your line. And they're thinking through this situation as well, right? And so when we think about all those things together, light, small, and dispersed does not fit well with that construct, because then you're going to have even more stripped down forces, even further, away from one another. So you can't reinforce, you can't support, you can't provide augmentation in the immediate needs situation that might arise. And so you open yourself up for piecemeal destruction very quickly, very fast, completely, entirely, all alone by yourself, watching your buddies all just get killed away as you're sitting there horrified that you're next, right? So I would say when we think about this, we need to be thinking about larger forces, more robust forces that can take a punch and keep going. Because the other thing you want to remember too, again, as an American who's always fighting offensive wars, it's always about the next objective, right? You never stop. You always keep moving forward. Well, you can't culminate once you've accomplished an objective, right? You think back to Napoleon, one of the biggest things that made Napoleon successful was the exploitation phase, right? The pursuit. He had a great quote, something about you march 20 miles, and then you pursue another whatever and slash them down as you're doing the pursuit. And that's really where you lock down that decisive victory. And so that's the thing we have to think about today. Again, having been an armor officer for 20 years, it was always consolidate and reorganize, right? That was the last thing you did. It's like, what about what's next? Well, then we're going to go into planning again and figure it out. We got to reconstitute ourselves. Our force structure shouldn't be driving that way of thinking. Our force structure should be robust enough to where objective accomplished, immediately transition to the next thing and keep moving forward. But we've penny pinched formations and militaries so much now that they're so small that they have no depth to them. And if they take a punch, the typical U.S. Army Combined Arms Battalion right now, if you're talking about a tank designated battalion, an armored designated battalion, it's 2 tank companies and a mech infantry company. That is so small, such little combat power, that as soon as you start taking casualties, real casualties, you're immediately having to just stop going on the offensive and start taking care of all the casualties, right? Because again, in the West, that's what we do. We take care of casualties. We don't let people just die. We get them off the battlefield and try and get them treated. And so I would argue, I do argue, when we think about that question in particular, it's bigger, more redundancy, more depth in our formations. And then that should also drive innovation when we think about how to innovate, right? So again, tanker, so I've got tanker bias. But when we think about tanks, right, we need to make tanks that are cheaper and more cost effective if we're going to have more tanks and bigger tank formations, not less. And there's ways to do that. You can pull out, I'm just making up a number, but half the crap that's in a tank right now, and it'd still be a pretty good tank, because there's so many nonsensical things in there that you really don't need and you often don't use when you're actually fighting the tank that could help save the cost for one, and then also, reduce the weight a little bit. But that's the other thing too. We got to quit relying on 50-year-old armor and start looking at different ways to, make armored vehicles that is lighter and more deployable.
And what kind of makes it worse is how fast that kind of force design stops looking like a compromise and starts getting treated as a new normal that is not built to hold, but is built to tick boxes. And once it's in place, no one wants to be the one who says, hey, this won't hold. I know we're short on time, but before we wrap up, I've got one last question that actually only needs a one-line answer. If you could fix one bad habit in modern military thinking overnight, what would it be?
Promotion systems.
And that, folks, that says it all. And I think we have to have an episode on promotion systems one day. Amos, thank you for lending your time to us. It is always a pleasure. I know we barely scratched the surface on this today, but I hope we can make this something more regular. And a big thank you to everyone who has been sending in questions. Keep them coming because we will read them, and when we have enough, we will put them into an episode. We will be back next week with a new episode as usual. Until then, stay safe and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.